Hi, welcome. My name is Michael Archer. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Maryland, College Park. I work very closely with Dr. Jacoby Wilson in the CEEJH lab. And also now, as of the past 2 years, I've been working very closely with Sandra Olek, and I'll let her introduce herself. But what we're going to talk about today are two kind of side-by-side co-developed tools for measuring environmental justice in the state of Maryland. One deals specifically with green space access, and the other deals with a broad range of other kind of environmental health and public health indicators. So with that, Sandy, I'll let you tell us all about you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sandy Olek with Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I'm with the Chesapeake and Coastal Services. I'm a program manager, and I work in the Maryland Coastal Zone, the coastal program, on coastal policy, but also on Project Green Classrooms, which is formerly known as the Partnership for Children in Nature in the state of Maryland. So we, the Department of Natural Resources, administer a program, Open Space, which funds local parks. We're really interested in green infrastructure and the co-benefits of that, and also in the equity of access to those spaces and climate and equity. So this all kind of ties together. So I'm pretty excited about this project we're working on at the University of Maryland.
Excellent. Okay, so we're talking about environmental justice mapping tools. So let's start and make sure we're all on the same page when we say environmental justice. What do we mean? And this is going to be kind of an interactive session because it's an interactive tool that we've developed. So the first thing I'll start off with is the EPA's definition of environmental justice, which is: environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And now this is not the only definition of environmental justice. So at this point in all of my talks, I like to kind of throw it out to the audience and say, what do you think what does environmental justice mean to you? And do you think that this is a good definition? Do you feel like this captures your kind of internal definition of environmental justice? Or is there anything missing from this definition? Feel free to you can respond in the chat or turn your microphones on. Let's get some responses. Make sure you're all still awake. Okay, run and grab that extra cup of coffee. Oh, I guess Nasif, are you raising your hand to speak?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, like, obviously, like, environmental justice for me, it means, like, basic quality of life, and like, a lot of times, like, it's obviously correlated with, like, where we might live and, like, the demographics thereof. So that's, like, a big, like, reason why it, like, means so much to really anybody, and why it's, like, so, like, relevant to our personal lives as a whole.
Sure, absolutely. And Vernice, of course, says if only EPA did this at a minimum. Vernice probably joins Dr. Wilson and myself in thinking that this definition doesn't go nearly far enough. And for one, it doesn't really speak to the systemic legacy, the legacy of systemic oppression and racism that have created these environmental justices in the first place. Let's see, now we got some stuff trickling in the chat. And Vernice also mentions it's 26 years old, it needs an update, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, was someone else gonna chime in? Yeah, so yeah, when we're talking about environmental justice, there's definitely an updated kind of, we all kind of have our own internal visceral definitions that might be linked to the injustices that we face in our daily lives. One of the definitions that resonates most with me is that, you know, Dr. Bunyan Bryant said that environmental justice is when we can all reach our fullest potential. And I mean, this kind of harkens back to what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying in his letter from a Birmingham jail. You know, I can't be all of what I can be until you are all of what you can be. So moving forward in the environmental context now, let's talk a little bit about how we use tools and kind of how we take this mapping approach and why we take this mapping approach. I think we definitely have to kind of pay homage and pay our dues to the forebears, the forefathers and foremothers in this movement, who have let us know all along that environmental justice is a spatial movement. It has to do with place and time, place and people. And so that goes back to PCB plants in Warren County, or sorry, a PCB landfill in Warren County, and Toxic Waste and Race, the United Church of Christ report of landfills and other hazardous industries across the country, and how they work in space, in proximity with communities of color, and how these impacts play out. Okay, cool. So now, but why maps? Because maps are a type of model, and if you're familiar with, there's the famous quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So why do we use maps? And specifically, you know, why do we need a visualization? Maps are a way of visualizing these data. You know, it's one thing to put words and numbers to data. I mean, that's what they are. But once you can put a picture to it, then you're cooking with gas, right? So take this Superfund example. There are over 1,300 Superfund sites in the United States. The top 5 states are New Jersey, California, Pennsylvania, New York, and Michigan, right? So if you're just looking at these numbers, you think, okay, wow, New Jersey has 116, but that's not too far from 98, 95, 93. So you might be kind of fooled into thinking that maybe that's not as big a deal as it is. And the reality is that New Jersey is right next to the other 4 states on that list. Well, with the other 3 of those other states on that list, with the exception of Michigan and California. So you're looking at it kind of in isolation with these numbers, 116, but this equates to almost 300 within this one area of the country, right? So maps are very powerful in conveying the data for environmental justice issues and environmental hazards. So in just kind of plainly, what they do for us is they help us explore layers of environmental justice concern, and we can use them to determine or compare scores of different census tracts in the state, census tracts, block groups, whatever your kind of geographical unit is, and also view additional context layers relevant to your area or someone else's area of concern, or the story that you specifically live and need to tell. But why would we have a state? Why would we have a Maryland state-specific environmental justice tool when we already have the EPA environmental justice tool, right? The EPA, the national level EPA EJSCREEN tool is very powerful. It's got a lot of features, a lot of data in it. However, it also has several gaps. For one thing, it only uses national data sets. And that bar for data quality at the national level is actually pretty high. There are more local level data sets at the state level, at the region level, at the city municipal level, that's good quality data, but because it's not applicable to the entire country, it's not included in the US EPA EJSCREEN. So one reason that you might want to develop and use a state level tool is that you can utilize your local data that you and your fellow residents in your community are actually experiencing and actually seeing. The next one, the next reason or the next gap, I guess I would say in EPA EJScreen is that you can't necessarily customize it to the local community concerns or the local community exposures for that same reason of it not being relevant to the national scale. And for instance, California has the CalEnviroScreen, which was kind of one of the first spin-offs of the US EPA EJScreen tool. California took it and made a state level tool, and they of course added in pesticide use because of the huge agricultural programs in California. And so pesticide is a specific exposure case, not only to California, but definitely not at the national scale. So that's something that if you're looking for it at the national EPA EJScreen level, you'll be missing out on. And I think one of the most important points that this is all getting to is that policy is local, especially policy that happens kind of in our lifetimes. And so if you can make a tool that is specifically addressing the exposures in your area, the challenges, the benefits, the opportunities, the barriers in your area, then you can use that towards your local policy. And that's really the main strength of these state environmental justice screening tools. And as I said, this is kind of an interactive session, so feel free to stop me and ask questions along the way. We got a lot of time to get into this. So this kind of creates a natural point of collaboration between our lab and DNR's purposes. And I think my slides might be a little bit out of order here, but DNR is tasked, and Sandy can expound on this, but DNR is tasked with protecting the natural resources of the state. And particularly when we're thinking about green spaces, green space is one of those indicators of environmental injustice that doesn't necessarily come to mind right away for a lot of people unless you lack access to it. And so what we know from the literature is that dozens of peer-reviewed articles point to numerous individual and social benefits of spending time in nature. You have restorative benefits in terms of being out in nature kind of lowers your allostatic load and your physiological hormone balance. Being able to breathe in fresh air and even just hearing the sound of like a brook, can calm and release these positive hormones. And also by virtue of kind of in a roundabout way mitigation, if you have green space in an area, if you have a protective forest in an area, that's one less area that's going to get paved over and turned into some form of industrial use that could emit pollutants. And so we also know though that communities of color and low wealth communities have historically had less access to green spaces, and especially in urbanized areas. And rightfully so, a lot of attention is paid to this issue in urban areas. But when we're thinking about lack of green space access, even in rural contexts, there might be high availability of green space, but when you're talking about access, and I'll get into this, it's not just a one-to-one of like, is there a park near you in space? And that means you automatically can access it. So as we developed our tool, we kind of followed from taking all of this into consideration. And this is a little bit of a mix because I told you that these two tools are kind of made in tandem. So this is the rationale and the explanation for environmental justice for the Maryland EJScreen tool. Excuse me. With our model for modeling environmental justice here in Maryland, we borrowed from the CalEnviroScreen model, which basically takes every census tract, gives it a score across 4 categories. So a score for its environmental exposures, pollution burden exposures, its environmental effects. Those are in the kind of environmental category. And then you have these population characteristics, sensitive populations and socioeconomic factors. So each of these 4 get a score. And then these are grouped together and then multiplied across these. Now, the reason they're broken up in this way, pollution burden versus population characteristics, is you have I lined it. I mean, I'm trying to think of a way not to read my slide, but I think I explained it pretty well here on the slide. You've got these environmental categories. When we're talking about environmental justice, you have the environmental side, and then you have the more social justice side of things. So our tool kind of gets at both. And so when we're digging down into what do those actual indicators look like, in this exposure category, I like to think of it as these are the exposures that you can't really get away from. If they're in the area, it's very hard for you to mitigate on a personal level, on an individual level, air pollution risk, right? If you live near a coal-fired power plant or a gas plant, you can shut your doors, but it'll intrude into your home space. You can wear a mask, but that's even, that's not going that's only going to go so far. So these are these kind of global, ubiquitous air pollution, environmental exposure risks in the exposure category. And then you have these environmental effects types of exposures, which are a little bit easier to mitigate. And so case in point is lead paint. You can have lead paint in your house, in your walls, and it's bound up and relatively stable. And I hesitate every time I say that because I don't want to say anything nice about lead paint. But what that does though is it puts you at an elevated risk, because if there is some kind of accident, say for instance, your son or daughter kicks a soccer ball through the wall, then you've got potentially a catastrophic exposure to that lead. So these are things that are kind of in your environment, but you can mitigate it a little bit better. But they still are worth mentioning as indicators of environmental injustice because that threat is looming. And then on the justice side, on the social justice side of environmental justice, you've got these population characteristics. Of course, health plays a huge role here. So we have initially here these 4 layers to start when we're talking about the health context: asthma, myocardial infarction, low birth weights, and doubling down and building up on asthma. I should mention that there are several other relevant health outcomes and health data sets that it's difficult to address in such a granular tool as we're trying to build, because a lot of that data is aggregated at the county level. And that's has to do for several reasons, one of which is data privacy and kind of HIPAA regulations. But what we did for these few layers and what we intend to do for more health layers is we actually disaggregated it based on population and kind of scaled it down to the census tract group, to the census tract in MDEJSCREEN and the census block group in the Park Equity Mapper. And then finally, you have your socioeconomic factors, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with: communities of color, people of low wealth, less than a high school education, linguistic isolation. Sensitive groups are also kind of included here in a demographic context, because your younger children with still developing kind of toxicological defense systems are at an elevated kind of sensitivity and risk for these poor outcomes. And the same goes for on the other end of the spectrum for our older adults. And so now when we're flipping back now to green space studies, this is kind of just an illustration of what I was saying earlier in terms of the data is in. We know that even despite having these great health benefits related to green space, access to green space is a huge issue, especially in, like I said, in our urban areas. What this NIH study is showing us here is that participants living near the highest category of green space are most likely to be white, most likely to be of higher income status. As a result of being in closer proximity and better access to these green spaces, they have a better perception of their neighborhood quality, so their safety. And they're more likely to be born to non-smoking mothers, which again, there are these things that you don't necessarily link. But when we're talking, this conversation has come up through several of the sessions today, when we're talking about this holistic approach to environmental justice and One Health and holistic approach to health, the connections are very visible. And so I mentioned earlier, what do we mean when we're talking about park access versus just park availability? So we ran a literature review to see what exactly do scientists and researchers have to say about park access. And that's just getting at the concept of, I have a park next to me. What are the barriers stopping me from engaging in this park space? So some of the ones just right off the top here are race, income, high school education, obesity, how old your home is, the size of the park, bikeability, walkability, air pollution. These are all detractors from your ability to access, that green space that might be in your backyard, but also in, just between you and that park might be a 4-lane or 6-lane highway with no crosswalks.
And Yan, can I interject one thing? So
Absolutely.
we always talk about access to parks, even though there's it's easy to think about it in the realm of green space, but the parks are the ones that are intended for public use with hopefully amenities or maintenance. And it's also really, really hard to capture data on just community-based green space or green space that's not really underdeveloped, maybe greenfield that's not intended as a park, but maybe used as that. So just want to clarify that on the data too.
Yep, definitely. And I'm just, I didn't have the chat box open, but I'm just seeing your question now, Vernice. Is race a factor in the screening tool? And yes, it is. It's not fine scale race, so it's not comparing races to each other, but it's comparing white to non-white based on the American Community Survey. And we'll get into the specific layers that we ended up going with pretty soon here. So this is a graphic that shows kind of the different functionality and features in our mapping tool for Maryland. And as you can see here, it's actually, as of right now, both the Maryland Park Equity Mapper and the EJSCREEN live in the same place. And once I go up into the demonstration, you'll be able to see how to get to that. And we'll run through all of these different features. So this is kind of my roadmap for the rest of the talk. I do want to point out, before I forget, the way, so if you're looking at this map here, so looking at this map here, you can very easily see these hot spots, but don't be, not necessarily confused, but take it with a grain of salt, because we intentionally created our scaling of these color ramps to show those hot spots. So I'll get into this a little bit more, but just keep in mind that these aren't evenly broken out categories. We specifically wanted to know areas of highest need for whether it's park space interventions or environmental justice interventions. So that's why the top 10% are kind of that darkest category. And then you go down and have, from 75 to 90, from 50 to 75, and then the whole lower half is in that bottom category. So these we can all do in real time. So I'll go ahead and open up the tool.
So while you're doing that, do you want me to talk a little bit about how DNR has been using it or hopes to use it?
Oh, please do.
Okay, so while you're doing that, so we, as I said, we are responsible for program open space, and also we work a lot with local jurisdictions on their comprehensive planning and required long-range planning efforts, such as the local preservation and recreation plans. So with what little leverage we do have, which is working with the locals, and we put out a state guidance and then work with the locals to, they're required to do a plan for us every 5 years that indicates their priorities for recreation investment, and they have to do local surveys and identify what their needs and priorities would be at the local level. And some of it gets into programming and after school activities and of course, ball fields. And I did see the reference to the artificial turf fields, which I don't disagree with, but I can't get into that right now. So we have asked the locals to address equity in these long range plans. So that's one particular leverage that we have. And so this is a tool that we have worked to put together and actually use the data that the locals have to provide to us on with their inventory of parks and amenities. And so that was used to build out together with other state data on state and regional parks to map access to parks. So we think it's a really good way of holding ourselves accountable, holding locals accountable, and also putting data in the hands of community leaders. And that goes to both sides on both of these mapping tools. And you kind of saw a reference to a third mapping tool that's under development, but on access to green space, which has a huge implication with, if we're out there promoting access for children in nature, we want to make sure that there is access and there are amenities and where we should be investing or encouraging investment. So that just kind of frames out from the state perspective as we work with local partners, as we work with funders, as we act as a funder ourselves. I think it's really great to have tools like this in our hand.
And apologies, I'm not Rohan, if there's stuff in the chat or questions for me to address, if you don't mind just calling my attention to that, because I can't have the chat window open while I'm going through all of this, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see the chat. I sent you a private message.
No, you're good. Thank you.
I'll do it verbally next time.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so this is our tool, and I guess I'll go full screen so that you don't see a billion of tabs that I have open. So this is our Maryland Park Equity Tool. And if you're familiar, for those of you who may not be familiar with kind of online GIS or our online mapping services, I'll run through some of the basic features before we get into kind of what you would use this tool for. So what I just clicked on to kind of get this full view of the whole state was this home button. Alternatively, I can click on this little crosshair, and it'll ask me for my location, and it'll take me there. So this is my apartment here in Greenbelt, I think. And so that's how right away you can kind of zoom in as a community member, or you know, if you're interested in wherever you are in space, you can get there immediately by clicking that button. And next, going through this line of features, we have our legend, which is kind of critical and crucial to any use of any map. And as you can see, we have our categories. Now, with the Park Equity Mapper, we're trying really hard to make it as accessible and easily understood as possible. And so what we have here are kind of these indicators, verbal kind of indicators to match up with the data to show you exactly what you're looking at. So it can be kind of tricky, especially with this, because typically you would think a higher score is better. But in the context of these mapping tools, the higher score means the worse the situation is, or the worst case scenario. So in this case, it's equity and park space equity and park space access. So these higher scored areas are darker in color. You can see out here in Western Maryland, concentrations here, especially around the Beltway, Prince George's County, and also here on the Eastern Shore and some hotspots. And when we zoom in on Baltimore, you'll see some hotspots in there as well. Next, we have our select tool. So for instance, if I am interested in where I live, I'll click on this crosshair again. It'll take me to Greenbelt. And I will click on this census block group. And the first thing it does is it shows me this pop-up. Again, it's just words and it's just numbers. It's informative, but it's not very compelling. So we implemented a graphical kind of view to visualize what you're seeing in the numbers. And so this is a kind of a dual bar chart. Oh, there, I thought that, I was like, that's not Greenbelt, but I'm gonna run with it. So it figured it out. This is Greenbelt. And so what you're seeing here is on the left, this blue column is the tract or the block group that I've selected. And on the right column is the comparison to the rest of Prince George's County, which is where Greenbelt is located. So I can see, just looking here really quick, I can see that Greenbelt is actually lower than the county, lower in score, which indicates better equity for a lot of these factors. However, I see here that Greenbelt has more adults 65 and older. But other than that, I'd say it's you know, quote unquote, beating the county across all of these other indicators. Let's look at an area, and I shouldn't say all of Greenbelt, because look right next door here, we see that the opposite is true. And so this is, again, I was talking about why do you have a state level tool versus a national tool. This is it, to be able to speak to this granularity is the whole idea, because it's not just that the town of Greenbelt writ large is doing better than the rest of Prince George's County. It's historic old Greenbelt where I live, which is still which has the same city council as West Greenbelt over here, but for some reason, for these reasons exactly, they're not seeing the same level of access to green space as I am here in historic old affluent Greenbelt, more affluent Greenbelt. And so that's the select tool there. You can also use the select tool if you're not married to one specific census block group. You can use the select tool to draw a kind of a buffer zone around the area that you are interested in. And then this is useful to an extent. This is useful if you're trying to figure out from a certain point, from a specific point, what kind of an area of impact might be. Now I say to an extent because it automatically snaps us, you can see, to the whole block group boundary. And this is something that we're working on to get it to cut, a perfect circle rather than taking this whole boundary, which includes parts of Beltsville and goes outside of Greenbelt there.
That could be really helpful on, I see that for like a green schoolyards application or something like that, when you're looking at access for green space for a particular school district or school or something like that.
Yep, exactly. And then you can also, if I click on this area, I can also see some more advanced data. Oops. There we go. Advanced data for that specific block group. But again, it kind of has to do with the scale of data that you're looking at. You won't get a lot of spread if you're only looking at one census tract. So this is better served if you want to see kind of how the spread is across the county, or if you have several block groups that you want to compare. But you've got your basic simple statistics here that you can use to figure out why these, or sorry, not necessarily why, but you can see kind of the variation across several tracts or block groups. And then finally, we have a report tool, which when I click on it, it spits all of this out into a PDF that you can then take and include, like what Sandy was saying, include in a grant application or some kind of justification of why you're doing a project in a certain area. And it takes a little bit for it to load, but all of the bars will fill in there. I'll close that for now. And then moving down the line, we have our side-by-side map viewer, which lets us look at two different layers at the same time here in Maryland. So for instance, if I am concerned with Prince George's County, which I usually am because I live here, and I want to compare maybe the number of children younger than 18, because as the Park Equity Mapper was birthed as kind of a way to figure out what children had access to green spaces and how they were we're not being served by green spaces. I can compare the number of children per block group here against distance to a park. Okay, and so what we're seeing here, and let me zoom out so you can see a little bit of differences there. So these darker areas here kind of represent more so more distance from a park compared to some of these other areas. And something is not looking right about this layer to me. It's looking like it actually should be the other way around, which allows me, it gives me an organic point to throw in that ground truthing is 100% one of the goals and one of the necessary steps in developing any of these tools. Don't take any of these tools at face value. But I think this is a coding error on our part, specifically for this side-by-side map viewer, because when I looked at it at the other tool, let me see how I get out here. Let's see if that's reflected there. So what we're looking at right now, or what we have been looking at, is kind of the aggregate of all of the layers. And before I go into depth about those layers, I want to point out kind of the background for a lot of this analysis being the land preservation plan and recreation plan, which gives us kind of this map of all of the reported park spaces in the state. And these are reported at the county level or at the sub-county level, and then given to the county, and then from there given to DNR. And so what you're seeing now in these different colors is this dynamic between people-powered parks, nature-based parks, or people-powered and nature-based. And what that means is if I click on any one of these parks, let me zoom to maybe this one here. So this is the darkest red, people-powered recreation. And what that has to do is the types of amenities and the number of those amenities. So the amenities are broken up in terms of trails, natural areas, whether hunting is allowed, whether fishing is allowed, whether picnicking is allowed. Waste receptacles, restroom facilities. So you can see this is the Howard County Conservancy. So this is, you know, a protected area. It's not necessarily meant for hardcore kind of recreation there. But as this is kind of just a binary yes, no, 0, 1 category, it's showing us that it's people powered. But if we flip over to nature-based here, we'll see yes for trails, yes for natural areas, and no's down the line here. So as you see your natural areas and your trails, that's kind of really pulling that towards that end of the spectrum there. So this is just kind of a simple graphical analysis of what you can do in these different parks where they occur. And another way of looking at that are the park amenities themselves. So the number of amenities, a higher amenity in this case gives you a darker circle. And so one thing that I'd like to point out, this is kind of one of my go-to analyses because it's just so striking to me, is when I'm looking at Montgomery County versus Prince George's County, you see that not only is there a much higher density, and especially within the Beltway here, there's a much higher density of parks in Montgomery County compared to Prince George's County. But you also see it kind of going across the range here in terms of low amenity parks and higher amenity parks and these highest amenity parks. Here in Prince George's County, we see that most of the parks are of that lowest amenity category. So this can help DNR and other policymakers know not just where to put a park, but what types of infrastructure, what types of green space to implement with their interventions. And so now let's take a deeper look at some of these layers that make up the tool. And I'll turn off these two layers and we'll go through kind of one by one these layers in here. So we, like I said, we did our 33 paper literature review of park space access and came up with several indicators that were listed in that slide, but then it came down to what data do we have access to. So once we screened through and kind of looked for the data that was available, we had to narrow it down to just these 9 categories. So we have population density, which is kind of intuitive in terms of just calculating anything when you're trying to map things. It's where are the people and how many people per area is often a very standard calculation of where you allocate your resources. Population density, 185% of the poverty line is our threshold for income status. Concentration of children under the age of 18. Concentrations of adults over the age of 64. Your non-white versus white population. So again, don't take this to mean that there are no people of color in these areas, in these lowest category areas. It's just that the highest concentration are in these darkest areas. The top 10% is in these darkest areas. Distance to your public parks, to your public park space. So we can zoom in. I don't know how many people, I don't know, maybe people in the chat can kind of list where in Maryland, if they are in Maryland, where they are located. And as I'm opening up the chat, I see that Jerry says, not all green space is created equal. How do the models deal with quality of green space? Vis-a-vis the plastic fields and tire waste surfaces, for example. And yes, that's 100% correct. We're trying to get at that piece with the amenities kind of structure, but as you might note, that says nothing of kind of tree density, canopy cover, or types of vegetation. And so one thing that we're looking to, especially as Sandy mentioned, there's the Park Equity Mapper, the Maryland Environmental Justice Screen, and then a Climate and Health Equity Mapper that we're developing. And through that Climate and Health Equity Mapping project, we're trying to pull in a lot more kind of green space indicating data with regards to tree canopy, with regards to NDVI, which is kind of the vegetative index for leaf color, and tells you a lot about how much an area is able to reflect sunlight and kind of defray these heat island effects. We're working at kind of getting at the quality piece in that way. But that's a good point. That's a very important point to add.
Plus the amenities that you've mapped out and how we're trying to break them into, I mean, we definitely have this debate at the Project Green classrooms and the advocacy level of promoting access to nature of, well, isn't getting outside and moving, the ultimate goal, whether it's, playing soccer or nature. And so people argue on both sides. So we really want, we'd like to see co-location of natural areas where there might be other recreation opportunities, but I totally agree that, there may be underdeveloped parks that are just currently a mowed field, and it's considered a park. But you have, there might not be any natural area there, or a bench or a bathroom, and having some of those amenities and keeping people comfortable and allowing them to linger a little longer because of that comfort level is a huge thing for promoting access for both children and seniors, as well as everyone in between.
Absolutely. Distance, so going down through the rest of these layers, distance to public transportation, because even if you don't have a park nearby, if you have good access to public transportation, then that's one less barrier to getting to that park space. general walkability, this is the EPA walk score, which takes into account density of crosswalks, density, sidewalk widths, and bike paths. Bikeability is also in that walkability index. And then linguistic isolation, which is something that DNR is particularly interested in developing their green infrastructure, but also their programming, and making sure that it's equitable, you know, across all Marylanders and not necessarily just the English-speaking ones. And so another thing that I like to point out here is that your rural context versus your urban context. So if I go in here, and like I said, we're going to look at Baltimore. Oops. So looking at Baltimore, and any of you are familiar with Dr. Lawrence Brown's work, the black butterfly, the white L, we've got a reddish butterfly and a beigeish L here. It's approximate, but it kind of follows the same trend because as I told to Vernice, we incorporated race in our model because it was, from our literature review, a significant factor of whether or not people had access to green space. But the context, the urban context tells you a different picture compared to the rural context. So I can look for an area that's in here in the top 10% for the state and click on it and see, and click on it. Let's see. Let me try refreshing. That usually doesn't happen. I did come prepared with screenshots of all these in the slides, though. Okay, so here we go. So looking at what is it that's making this dark red area of low equity? In this case, it's a very high low wealth score, and also a very high non-white score. And you know, I can click around to any of these areas, and depending how near or far they are to that first area that I clicked on, you might get something similar in terms of what's really pulling the data in this direction here. And this is another reason why we thought it was very pertinent to kind of have this visualization here, because the colors and the mapping, as useful as it is, it can be, it can kind of tell a story that it can make you think there's a story there that isn't necessarily there. And as a result, you might be focusing it, you might be mismatching your intervention for the spatial context. And so, but typically as we click around here in Baltimore, we see that one of the major things pulling it in this direction is the high non-white score and the high low wealth score. However, if I find a area of the same color out here in Frederick, Maryland, sorry. I'm using the track. I usually have a real mouse and I'm using the trackpad. So we're actually going to skip over Frederick. We're going to go all the way out here to Western Maryland, where we have this very visible dark area. And here we see that the variables at play are much different. So here you see, you know, not as high on the low wealth score, however, much higher on the youth score, higher on the older adult score, higher on the park distance score, very high on the walkability score. Or sorry, the walkability score is actually flipped because the rationale is that if an area is not walkable, then you have less opportunities to actually access your park. So this is showing that this area is in fact very low on the walkability score, or sorry, it's low on the walkability spectrum, meaning that there's less availability to actually get to what park space there is there. And so it's important to, when you're using any of these mapping tools, to really be able to dig in and see the data and visualize it beyond, be able to visualize the data beyond just what you're seeing on the map, being able to actually individually look at what the variables are, what the indicators are. And the same is true for our EJ score. So I'm going to flip over to our EJ score tool, which is conveniently here on the same page, and I'll turn on this layer. So this is the context of EJ, of environmental justice issues in the state of Maryland. Now, again, don't assume that all of these areas in the low category have no EJ issues. I mean, I can click on any one of them and pull up my chart and see that the sensitive population index here is above, above 50, it's 66, a score of 66, which is pretty high. It's just not in that top 10%, top 25 percentile. And so to kind of go through the list here, just to show you how you navigate through, these are your exposure layers. So these are those global kind of environmental air pollution area exposures that you can't really get away from. Some of these more easily mitigated exposures, lead, proximity to a risk management plan site, proximity to a waste treatment disposal facility, watershed failure, which basically has to do with the pollutant, the watershed pollutants, whether or not they pass or fail the total value of allowable pollutants.
Total maximum daily load.
That's it. There it is. Thanks, Andy. Your sensitive populations, and then your socioeconomic factors. And then this C, which kind of co-ops the copyright symbol, C is, in this case, it's for context layers. And this gives you more kind of Maryland specific information that you wouldn't find necessarily in the EPA EJScreen national tool. So you have your public schools throughout the state, and you can use this layer, for instance, if I'm concerned with this school and I'd like to clear this, get an idea of a buffer around that school. Again, it snaps to the nearest boundaries, but it shows you that it's able to show you that data. And I only have EJ score turned on, so that's why it's only giving you that score right now. We also have combined sewer outfalls, which I was in the stormwater section earlier. Oh, it's taking a while to load. This is a huge layer. But we were talking about Baltimore. So in Baltimore, it's an SSO, sanitary sewer issue, more so than a combined sewer issue. But that you have those issues kind of played out across areas in Maryland and Prince George's County. Power plants, Superfund sites, railroads, also brought up in the infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure talk, was the issue with railroads and bringing in fracked gas on rail, or crude oil, fracked oil on rail. And one of, especially, with being several or less than a few weeks away from the presidential election and other elections as well, we have this legislative district layer, which, for instance, in Baltimore can kind of show you the landscape of environmental injustices by that legislative district. And you can actually see the score associated specifically with that total district. And so these are all tools that you can use when you're taking them to regulators, enforcers, policymakers, and making a case. And I've said this earlier in the day, but communities often are made to show the burden of proof when it comes to the things that are being made to poison them. They have to prove, or we have to prove, that we are being poisoned, that we are being disproportionately overburdened by these factors. And so this is how this tool and other mapping tools that we are developing kind of get to that context and give you that ability to document what you're feeling, what your lived experience is, and present it to, in the form of data. Data is power, to policymakers and to regulators.
And I would just reiterate, having all of this data together really gives funders and policymakers an opportunity to self-evaluate and to target or amend or change policy that would allow for more flexibility or targeting or expansion of partners where partnerships don't exist, things like that. So we're pretty excited about the use of this tool.
Yeah, and one thing that I haven't covered yet is the model that we use and kind of the weights that we applied to this tool. So just to get into that really quickly, and I want to save maybe the last 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So these are the like I said, the 9 categories that we ended up with. I don't know if this little Zoom bar is in my way. I don't know if it's in your way as well. But basically the data shows us that the biggest factor is with regards to whether or not you can access a park is whether or not there's a park nearby, and whether or not you are a person of color. And beyond that, there isn't a whole lot of consensus. So we left all other variables kind of being equal, but made sure to kind of focus on these 2 major categories, because in every single paper, there was mention and data to back up these findings of park distance playing a significant role, and race playing a significant role. Now, there are conversations to be had about kind of confounding and race being this, we live in a system that is predicated on race and racism. And so there's a lot baked in that single variable there. But if nothing else, it's definitely pertinent to bring it to the table, the forefront, because a lot of tools in this way, they don't go near it. And they say that there's just not enough data. But we know that there is data. We've found the data exists, it's there. The associations are still murky, but, and I can't remember which session I was in earlier in the day, but you don't have, it was the air quality monitoring session. You don't have to prove that, you don't need the most perfect tools and measurement instruments to prove that there is a problem. The low cost sensors that communities are using don't match up to the federal reference method monitors, but they're enough to show that there's an indication that something is terribly wrong in those communities with regards to air pollution. Similarly, we don't have to prove that race is a factor in or a barrier to accessing any social benefit in the United States. And so I think that what our work does in this space is it kind of helps put that definitive first foot forward in that direction for us to further develop, these associations. And case in point, with our EJScreen data layers, there are a lot more indicators in EJScreen. So we did actually kind of defer to keeping all of those different categories being equal. But as we kind of move forward down this direction, I'm thinking that this model will actually change as we kind of collect more data and do more ground truthing, to really try and get at what each of the effect that each of these are specifically having on environmental justice issues in the state. And for our climate and health, and the same goes for our climate and health equity tool that we're developing and hoping to release should be releasing by the end of the year here. As of right now, we only have kind of 4 critical layers that we plan to definitely expand on, but of course, flood zones and sea level rise, canopy cover, mitigate. There was some mention in the chat of urban heat, I think with regard to the plastic turf fields. Medically underserved areas, speaking to resilience or lack thereof when you have these climate and health disasters, and then also proximity to nursing homes, because specifically, as we've seen with COVID-19, these are some of our most vulnerable communities when we're talking about climate, health, and other disasters. So I will stop there. Sandy, is there anything that you want to tag on here?
Well, I think, no, I tried to interject when I had something. I mean, this builds upon the park equity tool we first did about 8 to 10 years ago. And so we've been trying to use it and push it out for our local partners to use. But this expansion has just added so much, so many other context layers. We've reevaluated the tool, the model, and really tried to also build it upon local data and with our local partners. Again, we know that, as Jan said, no map is perfect and no data is complete. And so we're always, you know, jotting down notes and hearing from partners like, oh, well, this park's not on here, or why isn't this like that? So it's always an evolving tool. And we're also evolving how we're using it. As I mentioned before, you know, if it's a funding source that at the state level and there's a redevelopment happening, and just to be able to look beyond the footprint of the development and see, well, what amenities and what green space is there in the neighborhood, or whether it's talking about, you know, how do we frame the context of climate change and climate and health. This tool will really help to build that case. Or when we're looking at investing in stormwater retrofits or green infrastructure investment and the co-benefits, I think this can really help us to frame the strategies of how we're investing and bringing equity into many other and hopefully all threads of the work that we do.
Yeah, so thank you. I won't stop sharing the screen just in case there's some stuff that you all would like me to play around with for you all to see here. The link is here. Again, as Sandy was saying, it's still under development, but we definitely welcome folks to try out the tool and give us feedback. Jerry is asking if it's possible to merge the EPHT mapping with these EJ mapping tools or data. So, funny story. So for those of you who don't know, EPHT stands for the Environmental Public Health Tracking Tool, which is a product of the Maryland Department of Health's Environmental Public Health Division. And we are actually, another student in our lab and Dr. Wilson are working on updating the EPHT tool to integrate, you know, some of our findings from this project to improve that EPHT tool. So definitely looking to add more environmental justice context to the EPHT tool. Okay, so Nasib asks, how are the factors taken into consideration to equate park equity as a whole generally determined? Demographics, current policies. So I'm thinking, and Nasif, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, are you asking about how this tool is taken from here, generating the data, and then how that data can be used towards implementing policy?
Yeah, I'm just like sort of wondering, like, the data on this tool itself, like, how do you like sort of know, like, you know, like all the scores that you found, and like, you know, like various parts of the tool, like had obviously like the extent, like, you know, some demographics, or like some parts had like, you know, these like current policies exist or something, stuff like that, something along those lines. So how do you like know that those like factors that you put into the tool, like how do you know that those will be necessary to like, you know, find like the park equity situation as a whole, like throughout the state?
Sure. So yeah, your question is kind of a beefy one, and I'll chunk it out. For one, the data that's in this tool is taken from several data sources. One of the main ones being the American Community Survey, which is the U.S. Census Bureau. A lot of the exposure data and toxin data comes directly from the U.S. EPA national tool. The benefit of it being a national tool is it does include some of that finer scale stuff that we were able to pull out for the state and kind of clip for the state of Maryland. So that's one piece of kind of where the data comes from and kind of how or why do we know what we know and represent it here. Beyond that, we then go into kind of the modeling. And so the modeling is informed by what we know from other researches, from cited papers regarding these issues of park equity. And to my knowledge, there are not many park equity mappers, but there are a few other state level environmental justice mappers. So we started in our lab with the environmental justice mapping tool, and then kind of were brought on and collaborated with Sandy on the park equity mapping tool. But yeah, it's a model. Models are useful tools depending on the context. And in this context, what we're looking at is park equity. And so we've geared the model towards that. That's the same reason why the overall environmental justice tool is not necessarily a good indication of park equity access, because that model is not kind of tailored to the specific issue. Is that kind of getting at what you were asking?
Yeah, of course, that makes sense.
Cool. Any other questions? We've got about
And do you want to put the link to the mapper in the chat?
Definitely. Sorry. Here we go. We've got about 5 minutes left in this session. From here, we're going to go back to the main room, which is the room we started off in this morning. And that will have our plenary final session for the day and for the symposium, which is a discussion on JEDI or DEIJ, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues in the environmental movement and environmental justice movement. Let me scroll through and see if I missed any other. Oh. Are raw data accessible? If not, how can one see what the data sources are? Yes, so raw data is not currently available, but by the time we have full build out, we're going to be adding an option that links to GitHub. If you're familiar with GitHub, is a repository, a database repository, where we'll be uploading all of the data there, and it can be downloaded from there. And one of the reasons we're kind of using GitHub in that way is because we can kind of track not necessarily who is downloading the data, but how many times, and kind of getting some metrics on how people are accessing that data. And there's a help menu here that walks through, it's a guide to the tool. And the idea also is that the sources will be here built out as well. There are some gaps here, but we're starting to fill in more and more of the data sources there. And you can kind of look for a lot of these, like I said, a lot of these exposure ones are directly from the US EPA EJSCREEN tool. Yeah. Oh yeah, and Sandy also says that you'll be able to download it at the state IMAP site, and the Maryland kind of GeoHub portal. You can download the data from there. Great. Well, thanks, Sandy. We did it.
Thank you. That was a great demo.